There is a photograph in the basement archives of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Most people who work there have never seen it. It was filed under Catalog Reference EX GZA S19337, taken during the excavation season of 1933. And it shows something that, even now, the mainstream archaeological community has never fully explained. That shaft has 3 levels. And the third level was flooded. Not recently flooded. Not from the Nile. The water was already there when archaeologist Salim Hassan's team broke through in 1933. They pumped, they tried, the water came back. And so they sealed the level off, filed their notes, and moved on to other sites. For 66 years, no one went back down. That alone should stop you. 66 years. A sealed level beneath the Giza Plateau, below the causeway of Khafre, in a shaft nobody had ever seen documented in any ancient blueprint or royal decree. And for 66 years, not a single archaeological team returned to map it. But here's where it gets strange, because that shaft is not the mystery. The shaft is the entrance. What engineers found when they finally drained enough of the water in 1999 is what nobody talks about. Not the chambers at the bottom. Not the sarcophagus that was already empty when they arrived. It's what extends beyond the walls of that third level, into the rock, further down, in directions that don't match the vertical structure of the shaft above it. Tunnels. Not natural cavities. Engineered passages. Carved into the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau, at a depth of roughly 30 meters below the surface, in directions that have never been fully traced. If you've never heard of this before, that's not an accident. And if you want to understand how deep this story actually goes, make sure you're subscribed, because this is going to take some time to unfold. Hit the bell. Every piece of this matters. The shaft has a name. Egyptologists call it the Osiris Shaft. Catalog reference GZA OS001, though it appears in varying records under older designations from the 1930s. It was first encountered, not discovered, by Salim Hassan during the Egyptian government's systematic excavations of the Giza Plateau between 1933 and 1934. And the word encountered is deliberate, because the shaft itself is clearly not a casual construction. It was engineered. And it was engineered with a logic that doesn't fit a standard tomb. The shaft descends through 3 distinct levels. The first level drops roughly 9 meters and opens into a rectangular chamber. There are niches carved into the wall at precise intervals. The second level descends an additional 6 meters, and here the passage widens into a series of side chambers, each large enough to walk upright through. But the third level changes everything. At the base of the shaft, at a depth of approximately 30 meters below the Giza Plateau surface, there is a large rectangular room. At its center stands a black granite sarcophagus. No inscription, no cartouche, no mummy, no funerary offerings. Just the sarcophagus, and around the room a moat of water cut directly into the bedrock, so that the sarcophagus appears to rest on an island of stone. Hassan's original report notes that the water in the third level was brackish and dark. His team couldn't pump it out completely. They couldn't identify where it was coming from. And in their field notes, barely 2 lines address what might lie beyond the walls of that third chamber. The phrase is translated roughly as, "The continuation appears significant, but the season has ended." The season ended. They packed up, filed catalog, EXGZA 19337, and nobody returned for 66 years. When Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, led a team back into the shaft in 1999, what they found at the third level with better equipment and partial water removal was this: evidence that the floor of the chamber continues outward beyond the visible walls. The bedrock extends. And at certain points where the wall meets the floor, there are what appear to be sealed doorways. Not symbolic, not decorative. Sealed, as in deliberately blocked. from the other side. For decades, scholars dismissed this as symbolic. The House of Osiris motif, a representation of the Egyptian underworld common in late New Kingdom tomb design. The moat represents the primordial ocean. The sarcophagus represents resurrection. The sealed doors represent the boundary between the living and the dead. Ritual tombs have inscriptions. They have offering formulas, passages from the Book of the Dead, cartouches of the buried king. The Osiris Shaft has almost none of these. What it has instead is engineering, precision, a 3-level descent that serves no obvious ritual function if the only purpose is symbolic. And those sealed passages at the 3rd level don't read as symbolic at all. You don't seal a passage from the other side to make a theological point. You seal it to prevent access to something real. But the Osiris Shaft is only one data point in a story that is much older and much larger. To understand the full picture, you have to leave Giza entirely. You have to drive 2 hours south past the edge of the Nile Delta into the Fayum Depression, a shallow basin that was once a vast inland lake and is now one of the most archaeologically dense and least understood regions in Egypt. Because somewhere beneath the wheat fields and the mud brick villages of the Fayum, there is something that 5 ancient historians described in extraordinary detail. Something that all 5 of them called, without exaggeration, the greatest construction in the known world. Herodotus visited Egypt in approximately 450 BCE. He was not an impressionable man. He had already seen the pyramids. He had walked the streets of Babylon. He had traveled across Persia and the Black Sea coast. And when he arrived at a site on the southern edge of the Fayum, at a town the Egyptians called Shedet, he wrote these words. He wrote that what he saw there surpassed even the pyramids in the effort and wonder of its construction. He described a building of 3,000 chambers, half above the ground and half below it. He said the underground portion was sealed from visitors, that the keepers of the site refused to show it to anyone, and he said that he was not permitted to enter the underground levels at all. Strabo visited the same site roughly 4 centuries later. His description matches, not in the poetic sense, structurally, dimensionally, geographically, it matches. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History around 77 CE, described it again. He estimated the total floor plan across 3,000 column bays, so densely arranged that travelers moving through the above-ground section could hear their own footsteps echoed from a distance. 3 independent ancient sources, 3 separate time periods, all describing the same underground complex in the same geographic location. For centuries, scholars called it the Egyptian Labyrinth, and for centuries, they couldn't find it. The site they were describing is almost certainly at Hawara, on the southern edge of the Fayum Basin, at approximately 29.267 degrees north, 30.9000 degrees east. We know this because of Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, the father of modern systematic Egyptian archaeology, who excavated Hawara across several seasons beginning in 1888. Petrie found the pyramid of Amenemhat III, a 12th dynasty pharaoh who ruled around 1855 BCE. He found the remains of a mortuary temple complex to the pyramid's south. And in the precise area where Herodotus and Strabo described the labyrinth, he found a field of dense rubble, limestone chips, broken granite fragments, column debris so thoroughly shattered that he concluded the labyrinth had been systematically demolished by later dynasties and used as raw building material. That was the official conclusion for over 100 years. The labyrinth was gone. Petrie had proven it. But that explanation has a problem. Several, actually. Petrie's excavation methods were the most advanced of his era, but they were surface-level methods. He dug down to the debris field. He did not have the tools to investigate what lay beneath it. And Herodotus, who actually stood in the place and walked through its corridors, explicitly describes 2 components, an upper section and a lower section, half above the ground, half below it. Herodotus was refused entry to the lower section not because it had been destroyed, he was refused because it was sealed. If the lower section of the labyrinth was built below the surface level Petrie reached, if its ceilings are the foundations that Petrie found, then the demolition of the upper structure wouldn't touch it. It would still be there, beneath the debris, beneath the sediment from the flooding cycles of the Fayum Basin over 2 millennia, intact, or at minimum, structurally present. And if it's present, modern technology would be able to detect it. In 2008, it did. The Mataha expedition, named from the Arabic word for labyrinth, was organized by Belgian researcher Louis de Cordier, operating in formal partnership with Egypt's National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics, known as the NRAAG. This was not a fringe operation. This was not an amateur team with a consumer-grade scanner. The expedition team included Dr. Abbas Muhammad Abbas, head of geophysical studies at the NRAAG, alongside researchers from Ghent University in Belgium. They deployed ground-penetrating radar across the site south and southwest of Amenemhat III's pyramid. The radar was configured to detect structural anomalies in the substrate beneath the surface. What it found was not geological debris. The GPR scan results, published in the fall 2008 Scientific Journal of the NRAAG, showed grid-like patterns beneath the surface of the Hawara site, not random geological formations, not the chaotic signature of collapsed rubble. Grid lines, right angles, walls, arranged in a regular matrix, extending across an area the expedition's own report estimated at approximately 304 by 244 meters, an area larger than 10 American football fields placed side by side. The scan also detected 2 separate horizontal levels of structure, an upper level consistent with what might remain of a collapsed surface complex, and a lower level, deeper, more clearly defined, with structural signatures that were cleaner and more ordered, as if the lower level had not collapsed, as if it was intact. Here is where the institutional resistance begins. The findings were presented publicly in a lecture at Ghent University in October 2008. They were documented. They were produced by Egypt's own national scientific institution. Louis de Cordier then waited for the Supreme Council of Antiquities to release the official findings. 1 year passed. 2 years. By June 2010, it was clear the findings would not be released. The Secretary General's office had placed the Mataha expedition results under national security classification, citing the site's sensitive archaeological status. The official conclusions of the expedition, conducted with the full legal permission and cooperation of the Egyptian government, have never been publicly released. To this day, they exist only in fragments. Partial descriptions from the Ghent presentation. References in the NRAG journal. The accounts of those present in the lecture hall. It was sealed, it was mapped, and then it disappeared. Now let's go back to the ancient record, because the 3 clues embedded in Herodotus, Strabo, and Pliny don't read like poetry when you examine them closely. They read like survey notes from engineers who had actually been inside. The first clue is the number 3,000. Herodotus says the labyrinth contains 3,000 chambers, not countless, not many beyond counting. 3,000, a specific number. In ancient literature, round numbers are typically used for poetic emphasis. 10, 100, 1,000. 3,000 is unusual precisely because it's oddly specific. It suggests someone counted, or estimated with enough precision to choose 3,000 over 2,000 or 5,000. And when you apply ground-penetrating radar to a 304 by 2 hand 44 meter underground site, and your scans return regular grid patterns, depending on chamber size, a multi-level grid across that footprint could contain between 1,500 and 4,000 individual rooms. The mainstream interpretation is that 3,000 is a literary exaggeration, a number meaning incomprehensibly vast. But Strabo, writing 4 centuries after Herodotus, offers a structural breakdown. He describes the labyrinth as divided into sections corresponding to Egypt's administrative provinces, its nomes. In the Middle Kingdom, Egypt had 42 nomes. Strabo says the labyrinth has roughly 42 major sections. If each section contains a symmetrical arrangement of chambers, entrance hall, corridor, inner chamber, side rooms, then 3,000 becomes mathematically consistent. It is not an exaggeration. It is an aggregate, a sum of an architectural system. They weren't guessing, they were recording. The second clue is in Pliny. He writes that the ceilings of the lower section are formed from single stone slabs so large they require no interior supporting columns. Single slab ceiling construction in a subterranean complex. In the mainstream interpretation, this is dismissed as Pliny conflating descriptions, relying on second-hand accounts he never verified. But here is the technical problem with that dismissal. The Pyramid of Amenemhat III at Hawara, the structure directly above the labyrinth site, uses quartzite monolith engineering in its internal chambers. Large, single-stone elements, spanning openings, without conventional support structures. That technology was actively in use at this exact site. The builders of Amenemhat's complex knew how to cut and transport single slab elements of enormous size. If they applied the same technique to a subterranean construction built simultaneously with the pyramid, Pliny's description is not confused. It is precise. The question then becomes, where are those slabs being quarried? The Fayum Basin doesn't have local quartzite. The material would have to come from Gebel Silsila or from sites near Aswan, hundreds of kilometers upstream, which implies a logistics network, barges, canals, labor routes, organized at the scale of a major state construction project. And that kind of industrial scale operation leaves traces, geological traces, extraction scars, transport infrastructure remnants. Nobody has published a study looking for those traces in connection with the Hawara site. Not officially. The third clue is the most technically specific. Strabo writes that the interior passages of the labyrinth appear to change direction as one walks through them. That what seems to be a straight corridor turns. That what seems to be a solid wall is revealed as an opening only when approached from the correct angle. For centuries, scholars have read this as a description of deliberate architectural disorientation, a maze in the literal sense, designed to confuse intruders. But there is another reading. Underground structures lit only by torchlight produce specific perceptual effects. A passage with a consistent downward grade that spirals around a central axis appears to change direction to someone walking through it with limited visibility. This is precisely what a helical ramp descent looks like from the inside. And a flush-cut stone panel set into a rock-cut wall, perfectly flush, with no visible frame or seam, is invisible until you are standing directly in front of it at the correct angle of incidence. Strabo wasn't describing confusion, he was describing precision-cut concealed access passages. A controlled descent system, engineered to channel movement along a specific path and to make lateral access impossible without prior knowledge of where the concealed entries are. Not similar to a security system, not inspired by one. The same. Now, does this prove the most extreme version of the story? Probably not. A geophysical survey, 3 ancient accounts, and a sealed shaft at Giza don't constitute proof of an intact 3,000-room underground complex. The skeptic's position deserves full consideration. Ground-penetrating radar at the resolution available in 2008 can produce false positives from geological layering. The Fayum Basin has a complex stratigraphic history, ancient lakebeds, flood deposits, organic sediment compaction cycles, and these natural features can create regular-looking subsurface patterns that mimic engineered structures. Petrie's debris field is real and documented. The labyrinth very likely was partially demolished at the surface. And Herodotus was a traveler, not a surveyor. His numbers may blend direct observation with second-hand testimony and the natural inclination of a 1st century BCE writer toward the impressive. None of that makes the finding ordinary, because even the most conservative interpretation of the Mataha expedition data acknowledges that the GPR detected something beneath the Hawara site that doesn't match the geological baseline of the region. Something with right-angle geometry. Something with consistent spatial regularity. The scientific debate is not about whether something is there. It's about what that something is. Intact lower-level chambers, demolished foundations, a different structure altogether. The debate is about classification, not existence. Something is there. In 2023, researcher Mark Carlotto published an analysis applying space-based synthetic aperture radar imaging to the Hawara site. The SAR data, processed with subsurface structural detection algorithms, returned signatures consistent with what the Mataha expedition found 15 years earlier. Large rectangular elements at depth, ordered horizontal planes at multiple levels, spatial organization that, when mapped against Strabo's room-by-room description, aligns section by section with a multi-chambered underground structure precisely where the ancient sources locate it. Then, in 2024, an international team from the University of Pisa applied Doppler-based SAR tomography combined with machine learning classification to the Giza plateau itself. Their published results identified subsurface anomalies beneath the pyramid of Khafre at extraordinary depth. The report described 2 large cubic anomaly zones, each approximately 80 meters across, beginning at several hundred meters below the plateau surface. And it described linear tunnel-like signatures, connecting the anomaly zones beneath all 3 major Giza pyramids. Horizontal tunnels, connecting the pyramids. Underground. The findings were immediately contested. Hawass and other Egyptologists argued the methodology was unvalidated and the results were speculative. And those are legitimate scientific objections, but they are objections to the methodology. They are not excavations that prove the anomalies don't exist. The objection to a scan is another scan conducted under peer-reviewed conditions with published raw data. That hasn't happened. The response to each new technological finding at this plateau has been institutional resistance, not institutional investigation. If the anomalies are geological artifacts and the tunnels are misclassified radar noise, prove it. Drill a core, take a seismic reading, publish every line of the raw data. They haven't. What does it mean if even a conservative version of this is real? It means that beneath the most studied archaeological landscape on Earth, a plateau that has been excavated, scanned, mapped, and debated by professional archaeologists for over 2 centuries, there is a construction project that has never been accounted for in the official historical record. Not a room, not a single forgotten chamber, a system, connected tunnels, multi-level passages, sealed access points. A complex built during a period we call the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 to 1800 BCE, by an administration that was capable of organizing a 1 million-man civilization across a 1,000-mile river valley, and cutting stone with tolerances that still challenge modern engineers. And if all of it, every ancient description, every GPR return, every SAR signature, is pointing at the same thing. A sealed, multi-level underground complex built during the Middle Kingdom and concealed so thoroughly that the builders demolished the above-ground entry structures to hide where the descent begins. Then, the question that follows has never been officially asked. What is inside it? Not symbolically, physically. What did the ancient Egyptians put in an underground complex so significant that they sealed it from their own visitors, demolished the above-ground access structures, and described the result in terms that every classical writer who saw it considered more impressive than the pyramids themselves? What was worth that level of concealment? What record, what archive, what physical collection of knowledge required not just a locked door, but the elimination of the door itself from the visible world? That is not a question archaeology has answered. And the question that lingers longest, the one that comes back every time you look at catalog photograph EXGZ19337, is about the water in the Osiris Shaft. When Salim Hassan's team broke into the third level in 1933, the water was already there. Dark, brackish, not connected to any known aquifer in the documented hydrogeology of the Giza Plateau. Not sourced from the Nile in any mapped pathway. It came from somewhere beneath the third level, which means there is a beneath the third level. There is a space, a passage, a continuation of that system, below the sealed chambers, below the moat carved into the bedrock, below the uninscribed sarcophagus that nobody buried a king inside. The water came from there, and the water is still coming from there. Nobody has mapped where there is. Not officially. The Osiris Shaft opened to limited visitors in 2017. You can go today. You can descend to the second level. A guide will walk you through the chamber, explain the mythology of Osiris, describe the symbolism of the island and the sarcophagus and the primordial waters. They will answer questions about the New Kingdom, about burial practice, about religious architecture. The third level is still closed. The sealed passages are still sealed. The water is still there. And beneath those passages, in the direction that no published map has traced, in the bedrock beneath the most famous plateau in human history, the tunnels continue. They were cut, they were sealed, and they are waiting. If this kind of investigation is what you're here for, there is another video queued up right now. The sealed underground complex in central Turkey that predates every civilization on the official timeline, and the modern excavation that was quietly stopped before anyone could reach the bottom level. Hit like if this raised more questions than it answered. Subscribe so you're here when the next piece of this falls into place. The map has blank spaces, and someone filled those spaces in a very long time ago.